Good morning. Welcome to the UI Town Hall meeting as a part of the Board of Regents Tier Project. Thank you for coming today. We appreciate it. We're going to be adding a few chairs in the back, and there's plenty of room up front. For those of you who are looking for seats, if you'd like to come forward, there's still some seats here in the front as well. My name is Laura McLaren, and I'm the campus representative for the Tier Project, and I have just a few comments before we turn it over to our Deloitte panel to start the presentation today. The presentation today will last about an hour. They'll give some feedback. They'll give you some information on the business cases that have been presented to the board. And then there'll be about an hour for questions. There's a microphone here in the center aisle here up front. We invite you to come up to the microphone to ask your questions. We'll also be monitoring the online submissions, and we'll take questions online as well, and we'll introduce those throughout the question and answer period as well. Following the town hall today, there will be a media availability in the Kirkwood room, which is just down the hall here in 259, so we'll ask media to hold their questions until that opportunity, please. And at this time, I'd like to introduce Rick Ferraro, the Deloitte Project Director for the Tier Project, and he'll get things underway for us. Thanks.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for attending. Great attendance today. Thank you for the welcome to your campus. We're happy to be here. We'd like this to be as interactive as possible. We want to try to maintain that time at the end for plenty of questions. So we do want those questions to come forward so we can address them. We may not have answers to everything, and if not, we'll just say we don't, and we'll come back with feedback at a later date to find out whatever information may be missing at this point. I'd like to just introduce Virginia Frazier, who's going to go next, and then we're going to basically move down the line to my right as we proceed. I'll participate in the Q&A at the end. Virginia?
Okay, thanks, Rick. And good morning, everyone, and thank you for having us here today. I am Virginia Frazier. I'm the project manager for Tier, and I'm going to start things off by orienting you to the materials in today's presentation. But before I do that, I do want to thank everyone who has provided inputs in these materials to date, including faculty, staff, and students. We really appreciate all of the input that you've given us to develop these materials. You'll notice that the document that's on the board's website is quite dense. There's a lot of material there, and as we present the material today, we're going to orient you to the key contents and use the material that we're showing as a guide for the presentation. It's a little hard to see up on the screen, but all of these materials are also available on the website. We also want to point out the timeline that after going through the materials today, the board will have more than a month until mid-November before voting on any of these business case areas. So in the meantime, we encourage you to provide input and feedback on these business cases to your campus representative, because on October 22nd and 23rd, each president is going to be asked to provide feedback to the board. And that input will be very important as the board votes in mid-November. So we have more than a month to let you digest these materials, consider them, and provide feedback to your representative and through the website, and we highly encourage you to do that. As the team walks through the presentation today, there are 3 points that I'd like you to remember about these materials. And the first is that these business cases are still estimates. They're not 100% precise. These are the next level down in the analysis from the original opportunities that we identified back in phase 1. And they're used as a key input to inform the decision-making process. But that leads me to point number 2, which is that although they're not precise, we are confident that this is the right level of analysis at this point in time to inform the decision-making process. The board's considering transformational changes, and they need a solid analysis as they consider which areas to implement. But this is a transformational process that does not have a clear recipe to follow, because transformation does require some venturing into the unknown. The analysis at this point in time represents our best estimates of potential savings using all of the available data that we analyzed within a limited time frame. And in some cases, this data is supplemented by assumptions, which are clearly laid out in our report that's on the board website. We conducted hundreds of interviews across all 3 institutions. We reviewed volumes of university-wide data, including financial data, policies, human resources data, and systems data. We met with campus leadership to review and discuss observations and assumptions. And still, the analysis is not exhaustive. But as I said at the beginning, it doesn't need to be, because we are confident it's at the right level of detail to provide directional perspective to inform the decision-making process. And the third thing I'd like you to remember is that we do expect these estimates to change as areas may move into implementation and as detailed design proceeds. Some estimates may go up, some may go down. Estimates of potential savings should be tracked and reported and constantly re-baselined as more information is obtained and as details are fleshed out. This is an expected and natural part of the process as you move from estimates to establishing the viability of an opportunity and then moving into implementation. I'm going to talk a little bit more about implementation in a second. There are 4 main areas that we're going to be focused on today, and those include finance, human resources, information technology, and facilities. And we're going to go through those areas as we present the 8 remaining business cases from the original 12 administrative business cases that were selected by the board for further analysis. These areas were analyzed to create business cases and potential new operating models, and then they were summarized in an implementation roadmap. Additionally, potential implementation activities and timelines were suggested for the board's consideration, and the board may decide at its discretion which initiatives to pursue, the implementation timing, and the implementation approach. Again, I highly encourage you to provide input and feedback as the board contemplates these decisions. So I'm going to first walk you through the beginning sections of this document and then turn things over to the individual leads to talk about their areas in more detail. And then we'll get time for questions at the end after they've walked through their business cases. As we go through the business cases today, there are a couple of points of context that are important to highlight because they are important inputs to the board's decision-making process. Phase 2 focused on conducting an analysis to quantify potential investment costs and savings associated with each chosen opportunity from Phase 1. And quantifying these potential investment costs and savings is complex, as I just discussed, but we do feel like that this provides important directional input. Also, in some of the Phase 2 business cases, potential changes to the way that work is performed could affect the organizational structure and staffing levels at individual universities. For instance, as processes are simplified and as technology is further used to support transactions, the staffing needs to support different types of work may change. In these cases, it's important to note that there are many ways to realize these types of staffing changes, including by using natural attrition and phased retirements. And this is the way that we have modeled our analysis. In any of the business cases that proceed into implementation, the decision about how to handle any staffing changes would be made by the board and the universities working through their established processes. And we truly do recognize the sensitivity of this topic, and we want to make this clear in the beginning that we do take these business cases seriously and want to be open about the way that this analysis is conducted. I'm moving on now to slide 6. And the Phase 2 deliverables, as I mentioned, include the business cases, operating models, and an implementation roadmap and action plan. The business cases are an analysis of proposed opportunities to facilitate that decision-making process about which project should be undertaken and moved into implementation. The operating model that I mentioned represents how the universities operate currently and some proposed changes for the future. Categories in the operating model include governance, people, process, technology, structure, and performance management. And then finally, there's an implementation roadmap and action plan, which represents a summary of how the opportunities could be implemented over time, along with a list of potential actions. Some of these opportunities could be implemented by the universities themselves, while others may require outside support in areas that may require deep expertise or when internal capacity is not available. But there are a number of different opportunities, and we're going to be going through these in the implementation action plan and roadmap a little bit later after we walk through the business case areas. I'm now going to be moving on to slide 9. And slide 9, let me just catch myself up here. Okay. While the phase 2 components that I just described will provide important input during today's discussion, it's key to note that the outputs of phase 2 do not contain detailed implementation plans. The phase 2 outputs, in the way I think about it, describe the what of the analysis that was performed and the potential what of these opportunities and what they represent. The estimated investment costs, anticipated benefits, and the important inputs to decision making. But it's not until areas are selected for implementation where a more detailed how is created. We have an idea of how these opportunities can be implemented, and we've laid these out in the various business cases, which I described, showing people, process, technology changes that could occur. However, the process of actually designing how this would work on an individual campus is not a cookie-cutter type of recipe and involves working very closely with each individual campus and with faculty, staff, and students to design the how for that meets the individual needs of a particular campus. This also requires piloting and continuous improvement to modify any of the implementation areas based on the results that you're seeing. So if any of these areas move into implementation, a detailed implementation plan would need to be developed for each opportunity. Working groups of faculty, staff, and students would need to be engaged to work together to develop streamlined processes and to identify technology impacts and changes. Key performance indicators and metrics would need to be developed. The organizational structure would need to be designed, and job descriptions for new or changed positions would need to be developed, and intensive communications and organizational support activities would need to occur. So hopefully this makes it clear that the end of phase 2 does not provide us with a detailed implementation plan, but only as one part of the activity that would need to occur to support transformation. And now I am moving to the last slide in this section, where I'm going to provide an overview of a few different considerations before we get into the detailed business case areas. Before we move into these business cases, as the board decides which areas to implement and pursue for implementation, there are a few factors that we've raised which could affect the timeline, the costs to implement these opportunities. And the first one is perhaps the most important, which is the amount of change that the universities and the board can absorb. In a transformation effort such as this, the change aspects of this cannot be underestimated. Also, to consider is the number of people within the universities available to support implementation, the capacity, the skill sets available within the university to lead the changes that are described in the document, the funding available to implement business cases, and the dependencies between and among opportunities. These are all key factors when considering these business cases and need to be an important part of the board's decision-making process. And now I'm going to turn things over to our finance lead, Emily Todd, who's going to walk us through the first business case area. She's also going to walk through HR, and then we'll continue on down the line and save questions for the end. Thanks.
Great, thanks, Virginia. As Virginia mentioned, my name's Emily Todd, and I'm going to talk about the finance and HR business cases today. I'm going to start out by talking about finance. I'll provide a high-level conceptual overview first to orient people to the materials, and then I will provide commentary that's specific to the University of Iowa. As Virginia mentioned, there's a lot of material here, so anything I don't get to, I would be happy to address during the Q&A session. So the finance business case looked at ways to improve how finance transactions are processed across campus. Although each university is unique in their own way when it comes to people, process, technology, and culture, we observed that all three universities are struggling with some of the same challenges around finance transaction processing. Finance transactions, such as procurement requisitions, travel and expense vouchers, account reconciliation, permeate all departments and all units at all three institutions. Most departments rely on ad hoc administrative support to manage transactions. This can be stressful for staff who are expected to be experts across a wide range of areas. It can also lead to a lot of back and forth and rework between departments and central finance. This is a challenge that's very typical in higher education. Because of this, many institutions have started looking at shared services as a way to improve how transactions are managed. As part of our analysis, we did evaluate shared services at each institution. While shared services does appear to be an opportunity, it is not a one-size-fits-all model. The degree of technology, HR support, stakeholder willingness, and organizational culture are all things that need to be considered. Before we get into more detail, I just wanted to pause briefly and comment on how we view shared services, since there are many definitions that exist across all three universities. Shared services differs from the centralization of services in many ways. Shared services is a customer-oriented organization that is focused on service excellence, efficient service delivery, and continuous process improvement. Shared services often uses defined service level agreements and performance metrics to track service outputs and manage performance over time. Like I mentioned previously, this is not a one-size-fits-all model. Shared services exist in many universities and many organizations in many different forms. This slide represents a spectrum of shared services options from a more decentralized to a more consolidated approach. There are many hybrid options that exist within this spectrum. In order to be consistent across the analysis of the three universities, we modeled two options, the college-based model and the university-wide model. These two models are meant to represent a range of potential costs and benefits for shared services. The college-based model proposes reorganizing work at each college or unit to elevate some of the departmental transactions up to dedicated experts at the college level to provide services across a range of departments. Some of the benefits of this model include the fact that it's often more widely accepted by departments due to the smaller degree of organizational change required. It frequently has lower implementation costs, and the implementation timeframe is often quicker because there's less effort required to manage the organizational change. Some of the challenges of this model is that it limits efficiencies because it does not leverage the whole scale of the university. There can be duplication of services across colleges and units, and it does not encourage collaboration. Colleges and units may also lack the resources to implement these changes, and some units may be too small to justify having their own dedicated shared services staff. The university-wide model looks at developing a more consistent approach where services are provided through a consolidated shared services organization to the campus as a whole. Some of the benefits of this model is that you can increase consistency in service delivery across the whole campus. There's an opportunity to maximize efficiencies, and you minimize duplication of effort across different departments and units. There's obviously challenges with this model as well. Significant change management and organizational design is required to implement, and there's often more upfront investment required to make sure that the organization is well suited to serve the needs of the whole university. Now, before I talk about specific observations at the University of Iowa, I just wanted to broadly touch on how we conducted the analysis. We used a three-step process to analyze potential efficiencies for shared services. The first step was understanding the current environment and developing a current state baseline of effort. We conducted interviews, reviewed data and technology systems to understand the current working environment at each university. We then reviewed the master HR data file for each university and made and validated assumptions about how much effort staff are currently spending on key process areas. We looked at processes like travel and expense, accounts payable, procurement, accounting, and customer service support related to finance transactions. We conducted interviews, reviewed job descriptions, and used our knowledge of similarly sized organizations to develop a baseline of current effort. The second step was estimating the potential to restructure work and reduce effort in the future state. During this step, we looked at potential process, policy, technology, training, and role changes that could help reduce the current state effort in some of these areas. The third step was quantifying the number of shared services staff that could be needed in the future. We reviewed volume metrics, so for example, how many volumes of transactions around travel or procurement that each university is conducting on a quarterly or annual basis to help determine future state staffing needs for certain transactions. We used our understanding of best practices as well as the specific nuances at each institution to determine and estimate how many people could be needed in a new shared services organization. The estimates we performed were at the university level and formed the baseline for our analysis. While not 100% accurate, they serve as an indicator as to whether or not there is an opportunity to reduce the level of effort required in certain areas. These estimates will need to be confirmed during implementation, and a more detailed understanding of departmental nuances will need to be developed. During implementation, a resource allocation analysis, which is a department-by-department review of workload, will need to be conducted to inform design going forward. Since this effort is spread out across numerous people across campus, careful workforce planning that evaluates current departmental workload will be required in order to realize the forecasted savings and improve the quality of service. Now I'll discuss specific observations and considerations for the University of Iowa. We saw many strengths at the University of Iowa. There is a solid investment in technology, high degree of automation, and the availability of great data and metrics. There's also a strong commitment to process improvement throughout the organization. We also observed that the University of Iowa has already started thinking about restructuring how certain transactions are processed at the college or unit level. Colleges and departments like the College of Liberal Arts and Sciences, Dentistry, and Internal Medicine have already started evaluating different ways to provide services in a more consistent manner. We think this is a great start in rethinking how services could be provided across campus. With that being said, there were some challenges we observed. Even though some colleges and units have started to rethink how services could be provided, there are limited formal mechanisms to share best practices across units. We saw some duplication of effort across units in terms of thinking through how best to structure work. The current decentralized model in units that haven't reorganized makes it hard to train administrative staff on policies and procedures and new technology, sometimes resulting in rework and slower turnaround times on transactions. There's also an increased upfront audit requirement due to multiple internal and external audit recommendations that has created multiple reviews in the departments, college, and in central finance. Given these challenges, we do think there is an opportunity to build on the work that has already begun in order to develop shared services across campus. Providing coordinated support to assist with workforce planning and best practice development will minimize the duplication of effort around implementation and will ensure that university expectations are being met and best practices are being used. There is also an opportunity to provide processes, policies, and roles and responsibilities to enable additional efficiencies. For example, minimizing the number of audit reviews required could help balance efficiency and compliance. Having trained shared services experts responsible for processing transactions will also help increase compliance and reduce the need for duplicative reviews. Establishing service level agreements between shared services, central finance, and departments and units will help clarify service delivery expectations and roles. Shared services can also help reduce the administrative burden at the department level, freeing up staff time to focus on mission-critical activities around supporting student learning and research. I'll briefly touch on some of the financial impacts of each model. For the college-based model, we estimate a potential for steady-state savings around $1.8 million. This represents a net impact to around 24 FTEs across the organization, which could be realized through natural attrition. For the university-wide model, we are estimating steady-state savings of around $3.8 million, with a net impact of around 60 FTEs over a 4-year period. Again, attrition and phased retirement could be used to realize some of these changes. You'll note in the university-wide model, there's also more upfront costs around organizational planning and technology to really help rethink how work is currently performed. With that, I will move on to human resources. So The human resources business case also evaluated ways to improve the decentralized HR service delivery model across each university. While the HR analysis is similar to finance in many ways, it is different in certain key areas. First of all, the decentralized activities reviewed as part of this business case included both transactional and more strategic activities. For example, not only did we evaluate the effort around personal action transactions, but we also looked at the effort around benefits consultation, recruitment services, HR data management, training and performance management, and immigration. Unlike the finance business case, each university has a very different HR structure and is facing different challenges in the area of HR services. We conducted our analysis in a similar way to what I described in finance. We conducted interviews, reviewed processes and policies, and job descriptions to understand the current state environment at each university, and we used our knowledge of best practices, benchmarks, and input from university stakeholders to suggest potential changes that could enable a more consistent and efficient service. So let me talk briefly about our observations at the University of Iowa. The University of Iowa HR has made a strong investment in people and technology to automate processes and have access to great data and analytics. By reducing time spent on transactional processes, the university has been able to offer a wide array of HR services not typically seen in higher education. Things like workforce planning, organizational effectiveness, training and wellness go a long way to supporting the university. There is also a strong culture of ongoing process improvement. While Central HR provides core HR support to the university, each unit in college has its own dedicated HR support as well. Each major unit is mapped to a senior HR representative. In addition to these senior HR reps, there are over 100 local unit reps. Unit reps are often administrative staff who provide HR services as part of their job responsibility. Generalist expectations of HR representatives sometimes makes it difficult to track HR processes and policies. It can create process inefficiencies and knowledge gaps in some areas. For example, staff reported it is difficult to remain up to date on more complicated processes, such as Family Medical Leave Act compliance and consultation. There's also a lack of direct reporting relationship between decentralized HR staff and central HR, which has led to inconsistent service delivery among college and administrative units. We saw variation in levels of service provided across different departments. For example, some departments reported that their HR reps provide substantial services around recruiting and search committees, while other departments reported that they need to rely on ad hoc administrative staff to support these areas. Okay. So since the University of Iowa has already made a large investment in its HR function, we see an opportunity to further strengthen HR capabilities through creating a more comprehensive HR organization. The University of Iowa could consider establishing direct reporting lines from local HR staff into central HR to increase consistency in service delivery. The University of Iowa could also consider revising the HR rep roles into more full-time dedicated HR staff. Consolidating HR responsibilities among trained HR staff could help improve the depth of knowledge, service delivery, and efficiencies. In the future state model, HR reps may now be responsible for more than one department or unit and will be able to provide better and more consistent services to the constituents that they serve. Although reporting lines could change, HR representatives would still sit locally and would act as a bridge between local departments, department needs, and central HR services. We think that clarifying roles, responsibilities, processes, and services offered will improve how HR services are delivered across campus. Using the economies of scale and process improvements, we estimate that a potential of $900,000 in steady-state savings could be realized with an impact of around 12 FTEs worth of effort. And with that, I will hand it over to my colleague, Shomik Saha, who's going to talk about IT. Thanks.
Thank you, Emily. My name is Shomik Saha, and I led the analysis on the IT workstream. And certainly, it is my pleasure today to provide an overview of the different IT business cases that were developed. The basis for the work on these IT business cases was the data that we gathered from each university, including the University of Iowa, which was then used for the team's discussions and culminated in a number of focused working sessions so that we could validate key metrics and better understand the IT landscape. As we reviewed the IT landscape across the three universities, and specifically the University of Iowa in particular, we clearly recognized a number of strengths and leading practices in use here within the IT landscape. For instance, the world-class data centers, which are well complemented by high-speed optical networks, and the successful development of the Maui student information system. There are a number of other examples as well, but also headline, we saw the use of technology innovations, like, for example, the use of Microsoft terminal services for use as email machines for students, just outside the hall, for example. So some of the business cases that we have developed seek to build on top of these leading practices. And while I will reference a few slides in this presentation, typically the ones that are a little bit easier to read from a distance, but we're happy to answer questions on the entire document. So within IT, the business cases address various aspects of the technology function. So while these business cases can be implemented independently of each other, there's a favorable sequencing of these business cases that can enable the succeeding business cases to build on the successes of the previous. So accordingly, we will first review IT04 and IT03, which deal with the use of technology innovation and simplification of the applications landscape, which could potentially lower the cost of technology over the long run. Then we will discuss IT02 and IT01, which focus on unlocking efficiencies within the IT service delivery model. So the first business case that we will discuss today, IT04, has two separate components within it, namely the first one that we call desktop transformation, and the second one that we call the print green transformation. So the first initiative, the desktop transformation, essentially seeks to provide what we call a virtual desktop infrastructure. Some people might say VDI, some people might confuse the term thin client with it as well. But essentially, it seeks to serve a portion of existing desktop users whose machines can be replaced by thin client devices supported by the appropriate server and storage architecture in the backend. Just to provide a bit more context, a thin client device is a small, lightweight device that works just like any other computer, but with one key difference. Most of the data is stored within the backend VDI server and not on the thin client. Because these thin clients don't have hard drives, their lifespan is typically longer than desktop computers, thus only needing to be replaced approximately once every 6 or 7 years. Plus, it is far easier to replace malfunctioning or aged thin clients as the data is on the server. You basically need to replace the front-end device. They can also reduce electrical consumption by 50 to 70%, saving extra money in utilities. And for people who've seen some of these devices, while we do use a lot of the slim form factor devices, they look pretty cool as well in usage. So we identified about 13,000 Windows desktops used within the University of Iowa, and we estimate that some proportion of these could potentially be supported using this technology. So typically these computers could be found in, say, conference rooms, like the conference rooms just outside this hall. If you go out there, they do have fully fledged desktops, and in some cases, in many cases, they might be, you could replace them with these fully functional thin client devices, and which could provide some cost efficiency as well. But even student labs, checkout systems, for example, are good candidates for usage of these devices, in addition to some other desktops that are mainly used for like standard purposes, like, for example, Microsoft Office, internet browsing, using Java clients, instant messaging, email, Adobe readers, or even accessing custom-developed software. But we don't expect power users or advanced users who use software like, say, AutoCAD, for example, or heavy research programs to be able to use these systems, even though technically it is possible to do so. Financially, it might not be viable to do so. Additionally, this can open up some more options for device innovation. For instance, some students may prefer to access desktops for their classes using their laptops, either within the computer labs or perhaps even anywhere from campus. While this potential reduction in the need for desktop computers is not factored into this business case, this could be something to consider for the future because it provides convenience for the user and enables efficiencies at the same time as well. In terms of the cost estimation for this VDI opportunity, we have certainly factored in significant cost for the thin client device, for the server cost, storage, infrastructure, licensing, ongoing refresh for the infrastructure. We've added pilot, infrastructure contingency, training costs, and such. The next initiative that or effort that we're suggesting within this business case consists of potential activities to seek to reduce printer, paper, and toner costs over the next 3 years that we call collectively the Print Green initiative. So the first step, for example, there could be to incrementally increase the amount of duplex printing that is done across the campus, which currently ranges from 50 to 60%, but which could potentially be nudged higher towards 80 to 90% through user education and training, like, for example, like how to print duplex videos for users, or as well as by using technology features on printers to reduce paper usage, like, default duplex printing, or using software like PaperCut to report on printer metrics. The savings from this paper alone could be upwards of $80,000 annually, and that could increase significantly as we have used conservative estimates of toner and paper prices. The second effort within this initiative is to incrementally encourage the migration of print services from local printers to network printers. Network printers are usually more cost-effective in terms of printing costs and provide a lot more capabilities. Like they print much faster, they can print duplex more often, they bind, some of them have privacy options like store and print, for example. So, while we've seen there are about 2,000 plus local printers on campus, and what we see is that if some of these users can migrate their printing to network printers over the next 2 to 3 years, the university can significantly save on the cost of equipment, paper, toner, and other supplies as well. So all said, those are the two key initiatives that form the crux of this business case. And while we estimate that this could potentially unlock savings between $3 and $4 million across the 3 universities, for the University of Iowa, we estimate steady-state savings between $1.3 and $1.8 million with a payback period of approximately 2 years. So the next business case that I will reference is focused on the different applications and systems that support the various business processes across the 3 universities. What we found was that prior to the work in phase 2, there wasn't an integrated inventory of applications across the 3 universities. Therefore, multiple discussions and working sessions were conducted to gather and collate information on related to the different applications and systems used, totaling to about 700 key systems that were gathered within this inventory. About 350 were collected for the University of Iowa. While this still potentially represents a portion of the total applications and systems used, it provided us a number of directional indicators on the types of simplification opportunities that are possible. We found there were instances of overlapping or similar classes of applications that supported similar business needs. For instance, multiple desktop imaging tools, backup tools, help desk tools, ticketing tools, reporting tools, space management tools, building access system tools, for example, as well as opportunities in enterprise functional areas like library management or facilities management, where some of these tools and systems are coming to end of life. And hence, they provide an opportunity for some level of collaboration across the universities. So this is a point in the systems life cycle that we term as a technology inflection point, meaning this is a point where it is typically cheaper to make a decision to potentially collaborate together where it makes sense across the universities on things like, say, common selection processes, requirements gathering processes, architecture, pilots, implementations, and operations where possible. And it is also a point where the consideration of total cost of ownership, along with the level of customization needed across the 3 universities, could be used to guide the decision-making process. Of course, the key challenge for this activity will be to provide an effective forum for governance and collaboration on the applications landscape. So therefore, in the future state solution, we propose a CIO council that should include key IT and functional leaders who can then help to come together and establish a future state application strategy and roadmap across the universities. The primary mechanism we propose is the process of active governance, whereby as systems are up for retirement, or if there are systems where they're basically lower cost to change because they're not tied to business processes, the universities can engage in collaborative discussion to determine the more streamlined application landscape where it makes sense. As an initial marker, we suggest we indicate some areas like infrastructure and operations, library management, facilities management, collaboration, systems, et cetera, as areas to start on first, where you can potentially unlock some licensing, architecture, design, and operational savings. As I turn to the financials on this business case, I will headline it by saying that while the payback periods are longer in this business case, ranging from 4 to 5 years, a number of qualitative benefits will also result, like including the greater use, ease of use to share and collaborate on data and information, not only across the universities, but within the universities themselves. For University for Iowa in particular, we expect that active governance efforts have potential to unlock savings of roughly $2 million at steady state or so. We also propose that some of the efforts within this initiative could relate to enhancing some business case discipline for larger applications development and maintenance projects, which over time could either increase the value from that work or could reduce the cost of that application development work. So I've covered a couple of these business cases. We will now turn our attention to the final 2 business cases. IT02 and IT01, which focuses on unlocking efficiencies within the central and the distributed IT service delivery models through a number of levers like using technology innovation and streamlining of service delivery. What we're proposing in IT02, which focuses on the central IT service delivery model, is that there's potential to unlock some efficiencies because of a number of factors. One of those factors being the use of technology innovations, like I said, like thin client devices, convergence of, say, voice and data technologies, and the streamlining of the printer landscape, which could change the dynamic for core technology services and potentially reduce the volume of some of that work. We also see potential for the greater use of explicit SLAs so that performance on services can be clearly measured and in some cases modified so that the optimal balance of effort versus service quality can be achieved. We also see a potential for considering the increase of the span of control within ITS over the longer term, as well as proposing some opportunities to potentially pool related services within the central ITS delivery model. We expect savings of roughly $660,000 for the University of Iowa with a payback of over a year. While this could lead to a net staffing impact of 6, this could be more than addressed using normal attrition. The next business case that I will focus on, IT01, pertains to the distributed IT model and also indicates some methods to potentially unlock some efficiencies. As we reviewed the 27 different distributed teams at the university that ably provide various technology services, we found that there were some overlaps of infrastructure-related technology services, like, say, desktop management, server management, security management, and help desk services. These are typically capability areas where efficiencies can be gained through the adoption of technology innovations and the ongoing simplification of the applications landscape as proposed in business cases IT04 and IT03. There's also a benefit in pooling these services together and using consistent processes, tool sets, reporting mechanisms, and SLAs as well. We also found that there were over 30-plus server rooms at the University of Iowa, which certainly is already in consideration within the University of Iowa. We think that some of these could be considered for storage using the central data centers. So therefore, what we see is that these technology innovation initiatives, supported by efforts to pool some of these server room computing resources, could unlock efficiencies within this delivery model. Now, it is important to emphasize that while we do suggest the next evolution of the service delivery model, we're only proposing changes to a few capabilities, and not to many other capabilities like, say, local or proprietary applications development, business requirements, business analysis, strategic planning, et cetera. For the University of Iowa, we expect savings of roughly $2.8 million with a payback of about a year's time. And while this could lead to a net impact of 35, this could be more than addressed using normal attrition. I will also add that as we talk to a number of teams, some of these teams have a number of staff who are potentially retiring in 1 or 2 years, and hence, some of the efforts in this initiative could also mitigate the risk for the organizations that they serve in. So with that said, we have covered all the 4 IT business cases, and certainly happy to answer your questions at the end of this presentation. I will now hand it over to David Noon, who will provide an update on the facilities business cases and the preliminary implementation roadmap.
All right, good morning. As Shomik said, my name is Dave Noon, and I'm going to talk today about 2 areas, actually. The first will relate to the facilities business cases, and then we'll discuss the implementation roadmap. And in comparison to my colleagues today, I'll walk through the facilities business cases a little more quickly. These 2 cases related actually to UNI and ISU-focused opportunities. So we'll go through them, but the full materials are available online. For facilities, there were 2 business cases that were developed during this phase, and both of the business cases focus on energy management initiatives to decrease the overall demand for energy. One of the reasons these 2 facilities business cases were selected is because of the steady increase of energy prices over the past 10 to 15 years, and if implemented, these business cases can play a small part in decreasing the energy demand and help to achieve savings for reinvestment in the universities. It's worth noting that we feel both UNI and ISU will be able to implement these opportunities internally without consultant support going forward. So the first business case is related to, it's labeled as Facilities 03, and this case deals with reducing utility consumption by adjusting thermostats in classroom buildings during evenings and during the summer. The savings forecasted in this business case, again, are specific to UNI. And this business case identifies that classroom buildings with similar attributes and requirements can operate on a similar heating and air conditioning schedule to limit the use of energy when buildings are not being used. Our team identified this opportunity and did the initial analysis. However, the business case was actually transitioned to UNI representatives in August for additional discussion and review. And it's with that input that the numbers were adjusted and are currently displayed on the slide we'll see in a moment. Additionally, UNI staff feel that this opportunity applies during the summer rather than also during the rest of the academic year. And this is because they've already begun doing work to set back thermostats during other parts of the year. So it's through the identified adjustments to thermostats in the summer that savings are expected to be about $30,000 per year and will have minimal implementation costs. This is because we believe the changes can be implemented with existing university resources. All right. The next business case is labeled as Facilities 04, and this business case analyzes the potential savings at both UNI and ISU relating to implementing additional energy management initiatives, which are identified through discussions with facility staff at each university. Examples of initiatives within this business case include installing or expanding the use of items such as demand control ventilation, variable frequency drives for pumps, occupancy sensors, lighting retrofits, direct digital controls, and replacing failed steam traps. The initial list of initiatives could be implemented over approximately 2 years at UNI and ISU and would require approximately $2.5 million of investment to save $400,000 on an ongoing basis once fully implemented. Looking towards implementation for both of these opportunities, we feel that the facilities opportunities would benefit from establishing a formal process to identify, prioritize, and monitor the savings related to these and future energy management initiatives. And this will help to provide a steady stream of new projects to implement over time to achieve even greater energy savings and efficiency. So those were the two facilities business cases. And as we transition to the implementation roadmap, during the remarks you heard today, you've heard several thoughts relating to implementation approach and timing from my colleagues. And the implementation roadmap we're about to walk through is intended to provide a summary of these thoughts in a single location. I'd like to emphasize that this is a starting point and is intended to begin the discussion relating to implementation rather than being the defined path forward or the only path forward. Too tall, huh? I can start from the top if you need it. All right, so just emphasizing the point that this is just the beginning. It's not the only defined path that could be followed, and it will be revisited over time. The university presidents and representatives will be collecting input over the next couple of weeks and will be providing this information to the board regarding their input and point of view about these opportunities. Virginia offered some more specifics about this in the beginning of the meeting. There's also a board meeting scheduled in November to collect this, or later this month to collect this feedback, and then the vote will take place in November. So on this next slide, we'll actually look at a few dependencies that have been identified. These are common across actually all three universities, but I'll speak to them in context of University of Iowa. The first one is that the board approval is needed, and we just talked about that, the fact that in November the board will be voting, and that is required to move forward with some of these into implementation. Next, the selected implementation approach that is followed, whether or not it's a university-led approach or if external resources would be used to support that, could affect the duration and timeline of the implementation roadmap. The next one down relates to staff time and funding availability at each university. This is a clear dependency that will exist across all three universities. And next, there's a dependency for HR support for this transformation. Emily spoke to this concept, and we think it is critical to have the support of the HR function and have that organization be fully prepared to partner in some of the organizational change that may occur. And then the final two actually relate to technology. The first being related to application support and having the need to have technology support on hand to help with some system changes that may result from process changes that are identified. And then finally, to talk about IT governance, Shomik discussed the CIO Council, and it would be ideal to have this group in place to provide input into the IT opportunities prior to moving into implementation. All right, so I know the slide is small, but it is available online. And the main thing, I guess, before walking through, I'll point out a few things. First, in preparing this roadmap, we did take into account the constraints mentioned on the slide I just went through. So the sequencing and durations here reflect some of those thoughts and constraints. We also met with university leaders and board staff during the initial sequencing to discuss this initial sequencing, and some of their input is also reflected in this timeline. And then finally, the majority of these efforts are displayed and follow an iterative or phased approach to implementation, where changes can be implemented in a defined area before identifying lessons learned and revising the approach and expanding more broadly across the university. And there's also lessons that could be learned and shared across the universities as well. So as we discuss this roadmap, I'll actually walk through each lane and start at the top and work to the bottom. The foundation of this program is really related to having the project management, communications, and overall organizational support in place to oversee, monitor, and communicate program status and success moving into implementation. This function will also help to identify and mitigate program risks during implementation, and Mark Brown is leading the efforts in this area in his new role as Transformation Project Manager for TIER. The next row down relates to sourcing and procurement, and this opportunity has been voted on by the board and could begin soon. As we move further down, we've got information technology, and those areas are represented, and you can see that technology innovations and the application work that Shomik mentioned could begin prior to transforming the distributed and central ITS models. The IT application effort and innovation areas could begin as soon as later this year if the board chooses to move forward, and the remaining areas relating to transforming the distributed and central ITS delivery model could proceed later in calendar year 2015. Moving down to finance, this is one of the last initiatives that is expected to begin at the University of Iowa, and again, it would be ideal to have the HR support that was identified in place and ready to partner with some of that change. And then the next level down focuses on human resources, and there are two opportunities here. The lower one actually relates to the P&S Search Committee, and that's been voted on by the board recently and will be implemented by the universities on their own. The other one is the HR opportunity that Emily described, and currently it's on the implementation roadmap as forecasted to begin potentially in mid-2015. The final lane here relates to the student service areas, and both of these opportunities have actually been approved by the board and are expected to be implemented by the universities in the near future. So with that, that's a quick walk through the implementation roadmap. Again, it's a starting point for dialogue and reaction, and I'd like to actually transition to Laura, who will be helping us facilitate the Q&A session.
Thank you, Dave. So we'll begin the Q&A period at this point. We'd encourage you to ask questions of our Deloitte panel at this point, as they are available to answer your questions today. The microphone in the room is here in the center aisle. If you'd care to move up to that mic to ask your questions, we will get started whenever you're ready.
Hello, everyone. Chuck Whelan, Staff Council President. As you know, this highly affects staff, and I know on Staff Council we've been highly involved with, talking about these issues. So I have a few questions that I'll start out with, and it's Laura, if you have other questions that are coming up and you want me to step aside to ask others, let me know.
Chuck, why don't you start with one, and then we'll see if other folks have other questions, and we'll continue to rotate through. We have received questions online as well, and we'll be sort of interspersing those as well. So if you want to begin with
That's
your
fine.
First, we'll see if there are others who have questions as well.
Okay.
Thank you.
We'll start off fairly easy. As I know, you and I, the FTE reductions was a huge issue, and it was somewhat controversial up there. But could you, for us, further explain how you were able to determine the amount of FTE reductions for each of the business cases, because it has a theoretical feel, not a practical feel. Like, each family will have 2.3 kids, but we know there's no such thing as a 0.3 child. So if you could kind of address that to all of us first, because it's a great concern to us.
Yeah, I'm happy to provide maybe an overall comment or address that, and then maybe I can turn that over to Emily or Shomik to talk in a little more detail about how they actually conducted the analysis in their area. So thanks for the question, Chuck, and we're looking forward to meeting with you and others later today too to go through these questions in even more detail, so happy to do that. One thing, as you noted, these are estimates, and they depend on the models chosen across all of these areas. So any changes in staffing that we've modeled at this point would be achieved through natural attrition or phased retirements. And what that means is that over time, vacancies would no longer need to be filled in particular areas. And let me turn things over to Emily a little bit to talk about the specifics of how we made those calculations based on the data that we obtained, conversations with staff, and also with some of the analysis that we performed. So Emily, go ahead.
Sure, thanks. So as you know, when it comes to different decentralized processes and activities, there's no roster in terms of who's involved with what. It's very different across every department, and we recognize that each department has sort of taken it upon themselves to organize in different ways to meet their own needs. So what we did is we conducted interviews with people across campus to try to identify the types of people involved in some of these activities. We then looked at the HR master data file for the institution and sorted through to see, okay, what categories of staff are involved in some of these areas? How many staff are there in these categories? Can we make estimates on average about how these folks are spending their time? And how we did that is we met with different department managers and staff across campus to kind of get a feel for how work is structured in their area. We also looked at position descriptions for a wide range of staff to see what the percent breakdowns were in those, obviously understanding that some of those aren't as up to date as they should be, and there's wide variation. So we came up with what we thought was a relatively conservative estimate, and then we validated those with people across campus, and to the best of people's ability, they provided input to that. We then kind of used our knowledge of some of the process and technology challenges that each institution is facing to determine, okay, if we just restructure the work in this way, how much effort do we think we would need in the future state? And we used a couple inputs to that. So we looked at transaction volume. So each university is very different in size, how much volume they're doing in some of these areas. So we looked at that. We also looked at kind of best practices and benchmarks in terms of how many people do other similarly sized organizations that have done some of these organizational changes use to kind of determine what the delta would be between the current state and the future state.
There is an online question regarding HR as well, Emily, so maybe we'll stay with that. If I can read it to you.
Should it stand?
In the Tier Phase 2 action plan on page 9, so a very specific question, it states, engage institutional leadership in discussion on risk tolerance and monitoring process, the role of compliance in HR and recruiting process. Can you explain what you meant by the phrase risk tolerance as it applies to the obligations of federal contractors to... We'll need to exit the building. If you want to follow the exit signs, we'll go ahead and step outside until we determine the nature of the emergency. Welcome back. Thank you for making your way back in. We'll let people get settled here for just a few moments, and then we'll resume the Q&A. We will be able to add roughly 10 minutes to our time should we need that at the end of this. And just a reminder that questions that do not get answered, either from the online submissions or if in fact we aren't able to get through all the questions that you have at this point, you can submit those to us online and we'll make certain to forward those on as well. Okay? Thank you. I think we're ready to start.
Hello, my name is David Wilder, and I'd like to thank you for all the work that you've put into this. And I have two questions, and one is, as a taxpayer who recognizes that the University of Iowa has a rich history of significant innovation, continuous quality improvement, optimization, and cost-effective response to significant challenges, please remind me why resources are being spent on this process.
I think I can start with that. I think as we've heard the Board of Regents say, as discussed in the last board meeting and prior ones as well, is that the cost situation in higher ed in general and in Iowa is fundamentally not sustainable. Given the attention to tuition and student debt, there's a desire to contain cost increases as much as possible. And I believe that what you've heard today is a very reasonable approach to addressing that and is not one that's characterized by cuts. I think it would be a mischaracterization to describe it as such. We've identified positions that if you change the way work is done, which will require an investment, further investment, can be done without ultimately having to fill positions that are trit. And that is a very practical approach to addressing the issue. That does, in the longer run, you have to take a multi-year view here. It does reduce the escalation of costs and addresses the next opportunity, the next increment, if you will, related to organizational performance that every good organization strives to do. We're fundamentally identifying those next increments through our work here today.
Thank you. And my second question is, as a UI employee, I must avoid both real and perceived conflicts of interest. So, for example, when I'm asked to be on a government committee, say, for developing research directions, I decline because it's a conflict of interest to then bid on implementing that process. So I'm just curious, why is it not a conflict or an apparent conflict of interest for Deloitte to receive a contract to implement the recommendations made in their efficiency report, their efficiency review?
So first of all, Deloitte is not willing, for example, to engage in any contracts where we have any incentive for when any positions would potentially be eliminated. That would be a clear conflict of interest. We will not sign a contract to do that on an incentive pay. We are professionals, we're paid for our time, and it is very common in exercises like this to use the folks who did the analysis, who have become closest to the organizations and the numbers, to move forward with implementation, because as we do that, we learn exactly how each individual unit operates. We're positioned to go take the next step, because we know what is going on in that area. However, it is very clear, the Board of Regents has said no commitment has been made. We have no implementation activities contracted with Deloitte at this time. And it's the choice of the board to decide which way to proceed.
Okay, and I asked that question based on articles in the Press Citizen and in the Gazette. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Good morning, and thank you all for your time and for sharing this information with us. I am Kendra Malone with the Chief Diversity Office. My question is two-prong. The first piece of the question is in creating these recommendations and in the very detailed and in-depth study that you did around efficiencies at the University of Iowa, how did you consider issues of diversity and inclusivity in terms of the student body here, faculty, staff, the kind of human resources that make this institution work? What were your considerations in terms of how these recommendations came forward? So in terms of diversity, we're talking ethnic diversity, sexual orientation, and the ways that people actually engage in meaningful relationship with each other. How were those things considered in creating these proposed recommendations?
I would say that those considerations are very relevant for the next stage. We have done analysis that is based on other practices, identifying opportunities and trying to quantify them as best as possible with the data that is available, which is a little sketchy at times. But we've dealt with that as best as we can, applied our judgment, and said this is what you could do. Now, to go forward, the next steps require teams to be formed in every area. Every implementation that's identified here would require a team to be formed that involves the people who do the work and manage this work. No action would be taken without those people be fully aware of those things. Now, it is not the responsibility or intent of an outside advisor or consultant to have any view or position about an individual's continued employment or not. That is just crossing the boundary between a management consultant and a supervisor. These decisions are supervisory decisions that will be done at the point of time when it is relevant and likely a year or more from now, given the schedules that we've just laid out. So there's going to be continued discussion with every department that would potentially be affected. There would be dedicated communication activities to that department through the managers responsible for those areas before any action would be taken. You would all know ahead of time before that would be done. And again, there's a certain element of this that is up to chance, and that is you can't predict when someone is going to retire. You can't predict future attrition perfectly. You can anticipate it and plan for it. So therefore, we want to work with you. We've attempted to be as reasonable as possible given the situation. And we understand that this requires a lot of communication between management and the organization to make this all happen. There's a lot of work yet to be done before anything it happens. And then there will be a lot of adjustments that management will have to deal with when someone does decide to leave the organization or decide to retire, how to go respond to that. And that is yet to be thought through, and I'm sure there will be surprises along the way that people will have to react to.
So you said that you had pulled upon some examples of other work done in other institutions. Can you share some of those examples specifically related to the question I just asked?
As far as the question you asked around diversity or inclusivity, any of the implementation areas that would go forward would follow the mission of an institution and have to align with that. So that would mean working closely with university leadership and with HR to make sure that any future designs include all of the principles that are incorporated in the university's mission and diversity goals. So I have not seen an example of any type where that's not happened in any of the transformation or organizational work we've done. I think that's always the case, that the university mission is something that has to be preserved with any organizational change.
Thank you.
My name is Jason Mueller. I'm a staff member here at the university. Primarily, I think of the University of Iowa as a research and education institution, and I'm wondering, as we're talking about all of these changes, if we have, I haven't seen anything anyway in terms of measuring the impact of the proposed changes on the outcomes of research and education, so student achievement or whatever we're producing in terms of research. So I'm wondering if it seems like there might be a phase 4 that's missing where we evaluate the outcomes of the implementation, and that would be both in terms of the cost savings that you're projecting, because I think that those cost savings are really optimistic. But I would be interested in knowing what the actual outcome of that is, and if you're thinking about measuring the impact on students or research as well, how you would do that. Again, phase 4 seems missing to me.
So just to be clear in terms of our scope of work, what you heard today was about the administrative side of the organization only. So finance, HR, procurement, IT is fundamentally administrative support to the main mission. The ongoing assumption through that work is that impact on student outcomes and academic work is kept the same or improved in terms of quality of service. So there's no expected impact on those areas. However, there's other areas of scope that do address the academic program side, which are other business cases that are yet to be brought before the board.
I would respectfully disagree. I think if you're changing HR, if you're not measuring the service delivery itself, and you're only measuring the dollars that you're saving, HR goes directly to faculty and staff recruitment, which do have ripple effects into student outcomes and research outcomes. Additionally, just one example, the VDI could have impact on pedagogical methods used in the classroom. So I think that you can't completely remove student outcomes and research outcomes from this process.
I think that's a great point. Thanks for that. And in terms of the way we approach that is that those aspects are constraints to any administrative change you would make so that you aren't affecting that. And then in addition, when those teams are formed to do any process redesign or so forth, the development of metrics is one of the last components of that. Those metrics would involve evaluations from those being served in terms of ways to measure that, which I would argue is probably somewhat a little bit indirect in terms of direct student impact. There's one more relationship or two to be measured there. So I wouldn't say that we are developing measures saying the way we change processing of receipts is going to change speed of graduation or something as extreme as that. So it is still in the background. It's a design constraint we have to design around and make sure that all that is preserved, because research and education are the core of why we're here, and we don't want to affect that.
And, sorry, if I could just add one thing before the question. Apologies. In the implementation roadmap, I know it was small, but one thing that was on there was the top swim lane, which is project management. And one of the things that the project management function would need to do is look at the metrics that Rick is alluding to. Some of them are initially laid out in the business cases, but you would also identify additional metrics and measures that would be monitored. And the project management function would be looking at not just the savings, but also sort of those indicators or measurements of health. And to your point, we don't have any about student success related to some of the finance or HR transactions right now. That could be something, though, that function could help to measure and report on if it's desired.
My name is Valery Petrulovich, Business Services Department. I think my question is somewhat overlaps with the previous question. Basically, your current, first of all, thank you for your work. I think we can benefit all from this. Your current report provides only one dimension of efficiencies that you can introduce here, which is cost savings. But there are many other dimensions that we really want to know about, such as maybe reduction in time. What is our reduction in time in certain services, transactions that happens at university? How about improvement in quality of certain services? What about improvement of satisfaction of certain services? So these dimensions don't explicitly stated in the current proposal. So just judging proposal on one dimension, I don't think it really gives us a full assessment of what this actually will be getting from this. I guess my question is, are you planning to put any explicit indicators? What kind of other efficiency indicators you actually expecting to receive from proposed changes? If so, I think everyone could greatly appreciate this.
Yeah, well, first off, I'm excited to hear all of the interest in how to measure the outcomes of these different initiatives that do, and whichever ones end up going forward, because that's absolutely right on track. We have cost estimates in the materials that we've reported on so far, but also our leads have begun to identify key performance indicators in different areas that do encompass some of the items that you're talking about. So things like satisfaction with service. That's so critical when you're providing service to faculty, to staff, to students, understanding and then being able to react to any changes in service, to either help to understand what's working well that you want to continue to provide and build on, or things that aren't working as well because of changes that you need to then address quickly because of the impact on people. So absolutely agree with that, and we've begun to identify some of those. As far as what you're getting at is in effectiveness, so quality, and quality looking at items like compliance, or even in terms of things like reduced errors, that type of things. Those are all very important in areas like finance or HR, IT. We recognize that and completely believe that those are very important metrics to track. And then finally, the area that you mentioned around effectiveness, so not only being able to, efficiency, so not only looking at cost, but also looking at things like turnaround time or transactions processed or the time that it takes to process individual transactions. That's all very important part of the measurement process as well. So it's not just about cost. We really consider this efficiency being broader than cost and also encompassing many critical elements of effectiveness as well.
So is it fair assessment that we'll see more explicit numbers regarding this before the implementation stage?
In some of our business cases now, and Emily may want to provide an example, but we do in our business cases outline initial metrics that we've identified, and also in some cases where we have obtained measurements from each of the universities for those metrics. So why don't I go ahead and turn it over to Emily with a couple examples.
Yeah, so as we mentioned previously, we know the materials are really dense. There are actually on some of the business case summary slides, they talk about suggested metrics, but then there's also a section that talks about qualitative benefits. So that gets to the part that isn't necessarily measured through costs or savings. So obviously some of that's through metrics, but there's then things, if you even think about employee satisfaction with their job in terms of what their job function, I mean, we anticipate that there could be benefits there as well. We didn't necessarily measure to say how those metrics, those qualitative indicators could change over time, but we do note in the presentation that these are expected qualitative benefits, if that helps.
Thank you.
Good morning. Hans Hirschelman, President-elect of Staff Council. One question I had for you today is, in the business cases we're talking about today, I saw some references to improvements in technology, which led me to question, what is the actual interaction of these business cases with each other in terms of cost savings? I don't see any explicit saying of, like, in IT03, this would impact HR01. Can you speak to that item?
Yeah, I'll start with that first. Within the IT business cases, the 4 that we reviewed today, we think that they are independent of each other. However, there's a sequencing of these business cases that can help these business cases with their outcomes as well. In terms of, for example, HR technology or other changes that may have been proposed as well, our suggestion is that any technology changes would have to be reviewed in terms of what is the value and what is the effort that is required. And so, part of the what we'd call a results management office is to basically look at those efforts and to be able to, for example, if you're worried about what's the impact on technology organizations, there would have to be a prioritization of those efforts so that the technology organization knows these explicit priorities and can act on them as well. So we think that there is some thinking of what the sequencing of those are here, and there's some of that operation that'll kind of be done within the results management office as well, within the ongoing operations if these are approved.
Well, explicitly, I'm asking about the numbers themselves. Are they inclusive of each other, or do savings overlap between the business cases, or are there exclusions somewhere built in that we can identify?
No, they are independently developed at this point.
Okay. Thank you.
Yeah, to the extent we want to avoid any double counting of any potential savings, so we're very clear about that. And when we do understand relationships, so for example, in one of the HR business cases, there is a very explicit cost for an HRIS system. That's a technology need to be able to make progress on that business case. So we are trying to be as thorough as we can at this stage. Again, all this is going to be refined as we continue, but we're clearly trying to avoid that double counting issue.
And what, just to clarify, what Rick was mentioning was around the HRIS was at the ISU, one of the opportunities there. So some of the technology costs, I think, here, since there has been such a strong investment, aren't as substantial as some of the other institutions, if you look at that.
Hi, my name is Angie Lamb, and I'm sorry, I have to respectfully disagree with some comments you made earlier. I think it's a little irresponsible to say that the core mission of an institution is something you need to go around or call it a constraint. That's what we are, we're higher education. So this was kind of discussed earlier, but it's more development-based and less outcome-based. My question is, business cases were designed before a thorough and complete academic review was completed. Given that this is, after all, not just a business, but an institution of higher education, how were the effects that these business cases will have on our faculty and students recognized and accounted for in the development of your business cases?
Okay, I think probably a couple of us want to respond to that. First off, thank you for your comment. And I'm glad that you brought that up because I want to make sure it's crystal clear and that no one misinterpreted or if somehow something that we said came out wrong. We absolutely fundamentally agree that any movement forward in any of these areas must be aligned to the mission of each institution, not working around it and not viewing the mission as a constraint. So if that came out the wrong way in any comment, I want to make sure to clear that up because that's something that we personally fundamentally believe in the value of higher education and also in the worth of our universities and colleges. And I personally want to make sure there's no misperception about that because that's very important to all of us as individuals, let alone as representatives of a company. The second thing to more adequately address your question after that, each individual business case we looked at as a particular area, so IT or HR or finance, but we also did try to understand the relationship between those functions to the service of faculty or staff or students. And as we talked about a few minutes ago with some of the measurement that needs to occur and some of the additional implementation design and inputs that would need to be gathered throughout implementation, all of those are very important to make sure that the fundamental purpose of the university is not disrupted or somehow diminished by changes in the way that administrative functions would work. So what we're after is trying to find ways to best position the individual universities and the region organization as a whole so that it's operating as efficiently and effectively as possible to position itself for now and for the future. As many changes are happening in higher education, and as the needs of faculty, staff, and students will change over time. So our going-in assumption for all of this is that our intent would be that the universities would come out of any type of implementation stronger and more able to meet the needs of its mission and the needs of faculty and students. That would be our guiding principle. Emily, anything you want to add to it? Look like you had an example.
I was just going to add, over the course of the last couple months, we've also got the opportunity to talk to different faculty and staff across campus. And one thing we heard across the 3 institutions from faculty is, in some cases, potentially maybe they hired someone in their department to provide maybe research administration or student services support, but they feel like that person's getting so bogged down with sort of day-to-day management of different transactions. Or even faculty feeling like there's so much that's been pushed on my plate that's administrative, it's detracting from my teaching and my research. And so I think what some of these administrative business cases are trying to address as well is like, how do we minimize that? How do we provide services in an efficient way that can allow people who really are truly focused in the day-to-day research and teaching missions of the institution to really focus there and provide those services and focus their time there?
Thank you.
We do have a few questions online, and actually I was asking one when the fire alarm went off, so I think I'll go back to that. Emily, this was, I think, directed to you. In the Tier Phase 2 action plan, it states that the institutions, that you would like to engage institutional leadership in the discussion on risk tolerance and monitoring process in the role of compliance and HR in the recruitment process. Can you explain what you mean by the phrase risk tolerance as it applies to the obligations of federal contractors to adhere to regulations of the U.S. Department of Labor?
Great. I know that question specifically asked about that part of the action plan, but that was also a broader statement that applies other areas as well. So I'll just reiterate, obviously each institution needs to follow and adhere to any federal, state, or university policies and procedures, so we're not suggesting any change to that. What we are suggesting, though, is there's potentially an opportunity to review how we remain compliant. We saw in a couple different areas where there's just multiple levels of review and people involved in ensuring compliance. And there's different ways you can structure processes to ensure that you are being compliant, but you're not making processes inefficient at the same time. So that's what that statement is referring to, is just really having an institutional discussion in terms of what the right level of involvement is of different groups and how we can kind of be efficient while being compliant at the same time.
Thank you.
Play the short card here. Hi, Jessica Church. I'm in ITS as well as a staff council representative. My question is specifically in regards to the cost savings for VDI. Was it market value pricing that you were using, or was it university pricing that you're using to find out those savings?
Yeah, it was university pricing. So we basically got actuals from the university across the different distributed IT teams and the central ITS teams. We worked through a lot of that data in working sessions, so we basically use the data from the university itself.
Okay, so for like the computer bids that we have, and what that cost was taken into consideration when it comes to the cost savings?
That's correct. So
Okay.
the data that was provided by the teams themselves.
Okay, thank you.
We have another online question for IT. The Deloitte report recommends focusing distributed groups on specialized capabilities such as local application development. From a web development perspective at the university, we have developed a successful model of centralizing development and decentralizing content management. Can you please explain further your recommendations regarding the efficiencies that would be gained by decentralizing specialized development at the U?
Yeah, we are not suggesting decentralizing application development. What we're suggesting is that there are pockets of proprietary applications that are being developed today. That development is being done, for instance, in one location or one team, and from a efficiency standpoint, there is no efficiency in basically pooling any of that resource together. So that's the basis for what we talked about around proprietary application development. We are not suggesting any change or evolution to the service delivery model at this point.
I guess it's my turn again. As you were talking about benchmarking, analyzing the data, you have them as two separate functions. But when you talk about plan and implementing, which is the action, implementing is the action of putting the plan in place, you have it as one category, really de-emphasizing the plan itself. Why are we not seeing what the actual plan will be before we ever talk about implementation? Because we may have different ideas here what a plan would be than what you see as consultants. We're in much very different environments, even though we have the same goals in mind.
Thanks, Chuck. Happy to answer that. Try to make sure I answer both pieces of the question. So first off, when you're talking about implementation and the implementation plan, we have an initial idea of how some of these business cases could be sequenced over time. That's the roadmap that Dave talked about earlier. But the actual work of implementation, which is an umbrella that we use to cover many items, including detailed design and planning, and then the actual rollout of any of these areas in terms of piloting changes and measuring how those changes are performing, et cetera. So no detailed implementation planning has occurred at all yet. So that's why you're not seeing that, because that is work that requires working very closely with each individual university and with faculty, staff, and students at the university to actually do the detailed planning and design for the future. So we know from different types of transformation that we've conducted before, we know what the elements of transformation entail. We know that there are certain steps that you need to follow, which include that detailed design and planning and looking at redesigning business processes and working closely with HR to look at job descriptions and any changes in business processes that might affect those, or looking at technology changes. We know all of those steps, but how that actually occurs on a given campus is a very collaborative process that involves working with people who do the work every day. So that's why you don't see an implementation plan yet. And the second thing I'd add to that, though, is the board has not decided which of these areas, if any, to implement. So that's another reason why it doesn't make sense to do any detailed implementation planning until the board actually decides what to implement. So although, again, we have kind of an overall view of how that could work, until the board decides and until that detailed design would start, that's why you don't have that. I'm not sure if I completely understood your question about benchmarking and analysis. Do you mind restating that again?
In your first graph, you have step 1 is benchmarking, step 2 is analyzing that data, and then step 3 is implementation. We never talk about plan or ideas of how going forward. Now, in an institution this big, if you don't give the people the roadmap on where we're going, you will have very little buy-in. And that's what I'm saying. We're not talking about the plan. How are we going to get there? Where's the end goal? We're just talking about implementing. We have no plan. How do we evaluate? Can we do it better here than what you guys can do it? Are we going to be given an opportunity to present to the Board of Regents each institution's plan on how we could implement the ideas, the cases you've brought forward of efficiency?
Thanks for clarifying that. We recognize that there are some areas that the universities may want to take on themselves in these implementation areas. And during the next several weeks, that's what the university presidents will be hearing about, is areas where the university feels that it has the capacity and capability to implement these certain business cases. So that's part of the important job that President Mason will be doing when she presents to the board on October 22nd and 23rd, is areas that she has confidence in that the university could do on its own. That said, also, when you're talking about having the vision for where you're going, recognize that's absolutely critical. And when the board, I think, has laid out the vision for improving education for Iowans and for keeping the costs of education affordable to all Iowans and beyond. But as far as how that is going to be done, that's part of the next step with the implementation decisions that the board makes, and then laying out that clear vision and roadmap for getting there. Filling in those details again, working with individuals on each campus to design what that detailed future looks like.
One more follow-up. When you go to the Board of Regents, pretend we are the new Board of Regents of all the institutions. President Mason makes her presentation on how the university is going to go forward to achieve these savings. What would your presentation be? So the Board of Regents could evaluate whether President Mason's plan is better in all those areas, or whether your plan's better. How does the Board of Regents evaluate which plan to go forward with if there is no plan from Deloitte to compare to?
Well, and Mark, certainly if there's anything you'd like to speak on behalf of the Board of Regents, certainly feel free. But the way that we've laid out our business cases and the roadmap that was presented earlier is that overarching plan for how these different areas would be implemented from that initial level of based on experience of how these areas have the potential to be rolled out at these individual universities. So the board has been presented with the business cases. They've seen the snapshots of individual implementation areas in those business cases that outline the process, the technology, the people, and the governance changes that would need to occur to support those opportunities. Those are all compiled into the roadmap that we showed earlier. So that's our initial suggestion of how those could be rolled out over time. So I know I'm kind of repeating what I said earlier, but does that answer what you're asking, Chuck?
Not really, but that's fine. We can move on.
We'll get more of a chance to talk with you this afternoon, too. I think we have a few hours with shared governance.
I have a question from online, just one of the, sort of a logistical question about one of the recommendations with regard to printing. So the question is, how will documents be distributed from a centralized printer to individuals? Will deliveries be made? Who will make them? How much labor costs are involved in sort of the transporting of documents from central sites?
Yeah, I'll address that. Currently, there are a number of network printers. I'm guessing when they're talking about central printers, they're talking about network printers. As you recognize today, there are users who print to these network printers, go and pick up their print jobs, and then basically go back to their locations. We are not envisaging that there would be a delivery service that would be provided. However, what we do suggest is that as time progresses, as users get more comfortable with these network printers, as certainly the location of these network printers needs to be looked at and maybe positioned more optimally. As users get comfortable with these devices, they will then be able to move some of their printing to these devices, and that could potentially provide some efficiencies to the university in the long run.
Thank you. Another from the online submissions. I understand the need to optimize purchasing power. I also understand the desire to have more entire degree programs offered online. My question is, how will the Regents decide which learning management systems to purchase for all 3 universities to use? It is my understanding that all 3 universities currently use different systems. Once a standard system is chosen, who will be responsible for converting courses to a new shared system?
That's the reason why we are suggesting that a formation of a body like the CIO Council, where the key IT leaders would be able to look at the needs for their for their organizations, and then also understand the impact to the total cost of ownership across the 3 universities. So that would be the key criteria here. However, we are not really suggesting at this point any changes to the learning management systems because, to our knowledge, none of them are at end of life. However, there are some ancillary systems around those which could be potentially considered. So what we suggest in IT03 around the applications is to really look at some of the applications that are end of life at technology inflection points, and potentially smaller applications that don't have implications to business processes that are not critical to competitive advantage or important to competitive advantage, and to start from there to look at some efficiencies.
Hi, I'm Da Gong Wang, working Finance and Business Information Services. I heard some questions regarding how the numbers are calculated, and I'm very interested to know if we have a plan to publish a worksheet that you use to calculate those numbers. So we, who are interested, can follow your logic and reproduce the numbers and gain some, confidence in, say, if we project a saving of 1 million. So we like to know if it's 1 million plus minus 10,000 or 1 million plus minus 2 million. Thank you.
So if you're referring to IT business cases, perhaps, you know, a lot of the intricate calculations, obviously, that are there, that are represented within these business cases, the logic for these calculations are represented on those slides. However, the details of all of those, you know, we've basically run through a number of times with the leadership, with the technology leadership across the three institutions. Certainly, we can provide more of those details, but you know, certainly it is available with your technology leadership as well.
Hello again. The question I have at this point is, at what point were these baselines taken, and do they have a component in them to adjust for either growth or shrinkage in any of the institutions? As you know, we are on a path to try and grow the university, and I know both ISU and UNI are going to be doing the same. At what point in your calculations did you factor that in?
So the baseline, I believe, is based on current budget. So we always want to have that be the point of departure, so it's common. So any calculations are fundamentally a calculation off that baseline, either added cost or reduced cost based on what is an investment involved, or is there some savings that can be identified. And I forget the second part of your question.
Well, mostly it's in the sense of a growth. Do you see these like reductions in FTEs still being part of the savings matrix, or would they be reduced in a growth situation?
So where costs were known to be tied to expected growth, I mean, I believe we reflect that. But in general, the way we calculate these is that we assume you have a certain spend to do certain things. And then we try to identify adjustments to that and quantify those adjustments of whatever nature they might be to say, here's the delta from current baseline spend. So our savings amounts are off of current baseline spend. So there is shown in some cases a 10-year, in some of the templates, it shows a 10-year cash flow, if you will. It's not an attempt, it's attempting to predict those costs for 10 years. It's simply an attempt at quantifying how those costs changed during that 10-year period. And did, for example, they change for beyond, did they stop changing after year 2? Or did they stop changing after year 5? And in those cases, for example, you may have a payback period that's, you know, a 2-year payback period versus a 5-year payback period. In some cases, there are things that take longer to recover the investment, particularly also because we're relying on the rate of attrition in the assumptions and how they're calculated.
There's another question from online. I would like to know the other higher education R1 class institutions where Deloitte has worked and had similar engagements. Are there any you can share with us?
Sure, I can take that question. Deloitte has worked with several universities to analyze their administrative functions and to undertake transformation of many different types. And this includes transformation of technology and process and organizational transformation. But I do want to also emphasize that the analysis that we've performed here is unique to the Iowa Regent universities. So that said, I want to make sure that we make it clear that our past work helps inform the work that we do at a particular institution, but this is an analysis that's unique to Iowa. So we've worked with just a long list of universities, many of which are listed in our proposal that's out on the board's website. But as far as some quick examples of several universities that we've worked with on a variety of transformation initiatives, that includes places like UC Berkeley, Texas A&M, Indiana University, Florida State University. R1s would include places like Tufts University, Dartmouth, Harvard, Yale. It's a list that hopefully that gives you a little bit of a representation, but as I said, there is some more information out on the board website too in our initial materials and our initial proposal.
Sorry, I have another question. last time you folks were here, we talked a lot about, there's this elephant in the room that we haven't mentioned, we've kind of discussed, is the other piece that the university and all three institutions will be looking at is the possibility of performance-based funding. And I believe last time when you were questioned several times, the response we got was, well, those two things don't really go together, or my personal favorite, well, I wasn't on that committee, so I'm not really sure. I think that came from a regent, not from you folks. So I heard a word the other day that I think really describes what we could potentially be facing with the three institutions, and it's co-opetition. We are going to cooperate, and we are going to compete. And I just wondered if you wanted to perhaps change your response from last time or expand on that, because I don't think that these are two separate things, and last time's answers, I don't think, really left people feeling like you had given a very good answer.
So we can apologize for that, but addressing performance-based funding is not the scope of our work.
So they have nothing to do with each other, okay.
Really nothing to say about it.
Right.
It's really the Board of Regents to bring this together. They've asked us to do an efficiency review. That's what we're doing.
Well, okay, thank you.
Hi, can you guys estimate the number of personnel hours that the three schools have invested in this already, and what the cost of those hours is to the universities?
We have not attempted to estimate that, but we know it's extremely significant. We also know the Board of Regents are fully aware that it is a significant investment. Also, just recognize that the Board of Regents realizes that those hours are already being paid for. They're in today's baseline of spend as salaries being spent, and they're fundamentally a reflection of priority. So they've asked that to put a priority on participating in the process, to provide input to this, and then when they decide to move forward, they're going to have to think about, oh, we pay for all these salaries for all these people. Are we overloading the organization or not? And we clearly want to make that become part of the implementation planning. So we want to hear about that and provide that feedback through your president so it reaches the Board of Regents independently of us, frankly, so that it is clear. And this is really a decision for the Board of Regents as to their priorities for what they spend money on, if you want to think of it that way.
This is sort of related potentially. Question, how did you determine the number of people to interview and to gain input from in the initial part of the process? For example, it seemed like a small percentage of folks were interviewed compared to the number of people on campus. How was that determination made?
Do you want me to address that? Sure. So we submitted an initial interview list based on our understanding of the organizational structure of who we wanted to meet with on the first pass. And then we really relied on different stakeholders at each institution to point us in the right direction to some of the people we should meet with. Obviously, understanding it's a large institution, limited time frame in terms of how many people we could meet with, but we did try to get a very wide sampling of people, academic, administrative leadership and staff, as well as people who sit in different pockets of the organization.
Thank you. We've gone slightly over to make up for our visit to the outdoors with our fire alarm. Are there any last questions that anyone would like to ask before we wrap up this portion of the Q&A? We do have one last question online. There are several other questions online. So for those of you who've submitted questions that we're not going to be able to answer, we will certainly share those either with the board office or with Deloitte so that they have the opportunity to respond to those as well. There's a question about the thin clients and the use of Macs. Can you talk a little bit about how the IT implementation would impact other sorts of technology?
I'm sorry, could you repeat that again? Thin clients in?
The question was, sorry, I've just lost it, but the question was with regard to the desktop situation, the thin clients, would that be to the exclusion of other types of options, including specifically
okay,
Macs?
gotcha. All right, okay. So talking about technology diversity. So basically, the first place where the the Thin Client initiative is proposed for users using Windows desktops. And as we said, for a minority proportion, those desktops which are basically at end of life, and where there's more standard usage. However, while it is not factored into this current business case, there could be some additional opportunities in the future where maybe users who have a Mac laptop and a Windows desktop, for instance, and could potentially choose to use a thin client device as their secondary device, whereby they could use the Mac device to log into their virtual desktop from anywhere. And thereby adding convenience for themselves and potentially helping to moderate the cost of technology as well. That is not within the business case, but if that is the question, the potentials of usage there. So.
Thank you. We'd like to thank you for attending today. We know it was a good amount of time, and we appreciate your engagement in this process. We'd like to encourage you to stay engaged. As you heard Virginia mention, the presidents of all the institutions, President Mason as well, have an opportunity at the October 23rd board meeting to provide feedback to the regents. Some of that feedback would include what of these cases the institutions feel they may have the opportunity to implement on their own. So your feedback with regard to how you see these cases and questions and comments that you have about them is important to the process, and we encourage you to share them and share your feedback if you haven't had the chance to do that today in whatever way is most comfortable for you. There's a sounding board that's still available. You can speak to members of the sounding board. Shared governance leadership is very involved in this process, and in fact they have an opportunity to spend some time with Deloitte this afternoon. So your representative with regard to shared governance could be great resources for you as well. You can submit your questions and comments online. We will be compiling those and sharing those with the president so they have so she has an opportunity to consider all of that feedback as she puts together her presentation to the board. Certainly Mark Braun in the board office, he's the project manager for this. He's available to talk with you if you would like to speak with him, and you're welcome to contact me as well. The next steps, this has sort of been addressed, but I just want to make sure that you're aware. The next opportunities here are, there's a transparency hearing, the standard transparency hearing that the board holds on each campus. Will occur here on Friday, October 16th from noon to 1 p.m. in UCC. If you'd like to make comments that the board will have an opportunity to review prior to the October 22nd and 23rd meeting, please feel free to use that time. And then the board does meet here on October 22nd and 23rd here in the main lounge downstairs, where the presidents will have an opportunity to address this issue. The board will not vote at that time. I believe it's been mentioned earlier, but the actual vote on this topic, on the business cases in front of us today, will take place on Friday, November 14th. That will be a telephonic meeting and details will follow. So again, we appreciate your attendance. We encourage you to stay engaged in this process, and thank you for your time today.
Thank you.